3,000 years of White Tower tradition crumbled at the hands of one woman, and one woman alone, Cadsuane Melaidhrin. For 3 millennia, the Aes Sedai built a hierarchy so rigid, it was woven into the very fabric of their identity. A system that valued age over ability, reverence over results, and protocol over survival. Every step in the White Tower was governed by unwritten rules and ancient edicts. Every rank earned not by what you could do, but by how long you had lived, and how well you played the political games that defined the Amelin seat and the Hall of the Tower. This hierarchy was supposed to be the White Tower's greatest strength, a foundation that would keep the Aes Sedai united and the world safe from the shadow for all time. It was a foundation that Cadsuane tore apart brick by brick in a single lifetime, and she did it not out of malice or a hunger for power, but because she saw what no other Aes Sedai could see, that tradition had become the White Tower's deadliest enemy. The world was on the brink of destruction, the Dragon Reborn had returned, and Rand al'Thor was slipping into madness with every passing day. The White Tower's answer to this crisis was to cling tighter to their hierarchy, to debate protocol and rank, while the shadow crept closer and closer. Cadsuane's answer was to burn the rulebook to the ground and do whatever it took to save the Dragon Reborn, and in turn save the world. She chose results over reverence, and in doing so, she proved that the ancient ways the White Tower had clung to for 3,000 years were not just outdated, they were suicidal. To understand why Cadsuane's disregard for established law was the only thing standing between Rand and madness, you have to first understand the weight of the Dragon Reborn's curse and the White Tower's failure to address it. Rand al'Thor was not just a boy with the power to channel the one power, he was the reincarnation of Luz, there in Taming the Dragon, who had broken the world in the Age of Legends. The taint on the male half of the one power seeped into his mind every turned, and with it came the whispers of Luz, therein's madness, a constant chorus of guilt and despair that threatened to consume him entirely. This madness was not just a personal struggle for Rand, it was an existential threat to every living thing. If the Dragon Reborn lost his mind, he would either destroy himself or become a weapon for the Dark One, and the White Tower knew this. Yet their response was not to act with urgency. It was to bicker over who had the right to approach him, who had the rank to command him, and who could use his power to further their own political agendas within the tower. Some Aes Sedai wanted to control him, to chain his power and use him as a tool for the White Tower's gain. Some feared him so deeply, they wanted to lock him away or even kill him to prevent the madness from spreading. None of them saw him as a human being, a boy burdened with a fate no one should ever have to bear, and none of them had the courage to set aside the tower's rules and do what was necessary to save him. That is where Cadsuane came in. Cadsuane Melaidhrin was not like other Aes Sedai. She was over 300 years old, a veteran of countless battles against the shadow, and a woman who had never once bowed to the White Tower's political whims. She had spent her life wandering the world, not sitting in the tower's halls debating protocol, and she had seen firsthand the cost of the Aes Sedai's stubborn adherence to tradition. She knew that the Dragon Reborn's madness could not be cured with words, it could only be cured with action, and that action required throwing out every established law the White Tower held dear. Cadsuane did not ask for the Hall of the Tower's permission to approach Rand. She did not bow to the Amelin seat's authority, and she did not play by their rules. She sought Rand out on her own terms, and she spoke to him not as an Aes Sedai, with a higher rank or a greater power, but as someone who understood the weight of his curse. She did not coddle him, she did not fear him, and she did not try to control him. She challenged him, she confronted him, and she forced him to face his madness head-on. And she did all of this in open defiance of the White Tower's hierarchy. The White Tower's laws forbade any Aes Sedai from acting independently of the Tower's authority, especially when it came to the Dragon Reborn. To approach Rand without the Hall's approval was to commit a crime in the eyes of the Aes Sedai, a violation of the very hierarchy they had built. But Cadsuane did not care. She knew that the Tower's laws were not just irrelevant in the face of the apocalypse, they were a barrier to survival. If she had followed the rules, if she had waited for the Hall to debate and the Amelin to approve, she would have arrived too late. Rand would have succumbed to the madness and the world would have fallen to the shadow. Cadsuane's utter disregard for established law was not an act of rebellion. It was an act of necessity. It was the only choice she had, and it was the only choice that could have saved Rand. She proved that tradition, when it is placed above survival, is not a virtue, it is a death sentence. The White Tower had spent 3,000 years building a system that was supposed to protect the world, but that system had become so rigid, so focused on its own internal politics, that it could not see the very threat it was meant to fight. Cadsuane tore that system down because she had to, because the alternative was the end of everything. And as Rand's madness began to recede, as he began to find his footing and his humanity again, it became clear that Cadsuane's way, the way of results over reverence, was the only way forward. The 3,000-year-old hierarchy of the White Tower had failed, but one woman's refusal to bow to it had succeeded. That is the truth at the heart of Cadsuane's legacy in these early days, the truth that the White Tower would spend years trying to deny. Tradition is not always a strength. Sometimes it is the enemy of survival, and sometimes the only way to save the world is to burn the rulebook and start over. Cadsuane Melaidhrin knew this truth better than any Aes Sedai who ever lived, and she acted on it without hesitation, without apology, and without a single thought for the hierarchy she was dismantling. For Rand al'Thor, for the Aes Sedai, and for the entire world, it was the greatest gift she ever gave, and it was a gift that only a woman who did not care about the White Tower's rules could possibly offer. The road ahead would be long and hard, and Cadsuane's actions would have consequences that no one could have foreseen, but in that moment, when Rand was teetering on the brink of madness, Cadsuane's disregard for established law was the only light in the darkness. It was the only thing standing between the world and the shadow, and it was the first crack in the 3,000-year-old foundation of the White Tower. A crack that would only grow larger as Cadsuane continued to act, and as the world continued to change. The White Tower would never be the same again, and that was exactly what the world needed. Cadsuane Melaidhrin is known across the world as the ultimate Aes Sedai. But that title was never given to her by the White Tower, it was earned by her refusal to play their political games. To the people of the world, to the kings and queens, the farmers and the soldiers, Cadsuane is a legend, a living symbol of what the Aes Sedai are supposed to be: a warrior of the light, a defender of the innocent, and a woman who wields the one power with a strength and a skill that few can match. To the White Tower, however, Cadsuane is a thorn in their side, a rebel, a woman who refuses to acknowledge their authority, and who flouts their rules at every turn. She is the ultimate Aes Sedai in spite of the White Tower, not because of it, and that is the core of her myth, the reason why her reputation has grown far beyond the walls of the White Tower, and why that reputation has become her greatest weapon. Her legend is not built on her age or her power or her rank within the tower. It is built on her unwavering refusal to participate in the internal politics that have eaten away at the Aes Sedai for centuries. It is built on her belief that the Aes Sedai's true purpose is to fight the shadow, not to bicker with one another over rank and protocol. And it is this belief that has made her a figure of both fear and admiration across the world. To understand Cadsuane's myth, you have to first understand the state of the White Tower in the years before the Dragon Reborn's return, a state of constant political infighting, where the Amelin's seat and the whole of the tower spent more time jockeying for power than they did fighting the shadow. The Aes Sedai had once been a united force, a beacon of light in a dark world, but over the centuries, their hierarchy had become so entrenched that their political games had become their primary focus. Sisters would plot against one another for higher rank, for more power, for the ear of the Amelin seat, and these plots often took precedence over the Aes Sedai's sacred duty to protect the world. Younger sisters were forced to bow to older sisters, not because of ability, but because of age. Talented sisters were overlooked because they did not play the political games, and the Hall of the Tower would debate every decision for weeks, even months, while the shadow grew stronger and stronger. This was the White Tower that Cadsuane rejected, a tower where politics came before duty, where tradition came before action, and where rank came before ability. Cadsuane was born over 300 years ago, and from the very beginning she refused to participate in this system. She was a powerful channeler, even as a novice, her strength in the one power rivaling that of many full sisters. And she had a will of iron, a refusal to be told what to do, and a hatred of pointless political bickering. She completed her training and earned the shawl of an Aes Sedai, but she did not stay in the White Tower. She left, and she spent the next 3 centuries wandering the world, fighting the shadow, helping those in need, and building a reputation that had nothing to do with the tower's hierarchy. She became known as a woman who could solve any problem, a woman who could defeat any foe, and a woman who did not care about the rank or the title of the people she worked with. She would help a farmer fight off a band of Trollocs just as readily as she would help a king defend his kingdom, and she would never ask for anything in return. She did not seek glory, she did not seek power, and she did not seek the approval of the White Tower. She simply did what was right, and that was enough. It was this life, this refusal to play the Tower's games that built Cadsuane's myth as the ultimate Aes Sedai. The people of the world did not care about her rank within the White Tower. They did not care about her age or her political alliances. They only cared about what she did. She was a true Aes Sedai in every sense of the word, a defender of the light, and that is how she was remembered. Meanwhile, the White Tower's own Aes Sedai were losing the respect of the world because of their political infighting. People saw the Aes Sedai bickering in the Tower's halls, while the Shadow threatened their homes and their families, and they began to question what the Aes Sedai's true purpose was. Cadsuane, however, was a constant reminder of what the Aes Sedai could be, and that only served to make her legend grow even larger. When Cadsuane returned to the White Tower, after centuries of wandering, her arrival sent a shockwave through the entire institution, a shockwave that was felt by the Amelin seat, the hall of the tower, and every sister in between. Her return was unexpected, unannounced, and unapologetic, and she did not come back to bow to the tower's authority. She came back, save the Dragon Reborn, and to force the Aes Sedai to do their duty. What made her return even more shocking was her immediate dismissal of centuries of established hierarchy as nothing more than petty bickering. She walked into the hall of the tower, a place where only the most senior and most powerful sisters dared to speak, and she spoke her mind without fear, without deference, and without a single thought for the rank of the sisters around her. She looked at the Amelin seat and the sitters, the women who had spent their lives climbing the tower's hierarchy, and she told them that their debates, their plots, and their power struggles were meaningless in the face of the apocalypse. She told them that they were wasting their time bickering over rank while the Dragon Reborn slipped into madness, and while the Shadow prepared to destroy the world. She dismissed their centuries of tradition, their unwritten rules, and their sacred hierarchy as nothing more than childish squabbling, and there was nothing they could do about it. Because Cadsuane's legendary status had created a shield around her, a shield that no amount of political power or hierarchical rank could penetrate. The White Tower could not punish her for her insolence, they could not strip her of her rank, and they could not silence her because she was too famous, too powerful, and too revered by the people of the world. If the White Tower tried to harm Cadsuane, it would lose what little respect it still had left among the nations of the world. It would be seen as attacking a hero, a defender of the light, and that was a risk the Amerlin's seat and the hall of the tower could not take. Cadsuane's legend had made her untouchable, and she used that untouchability to begin dismantling the traditional authority of the Amelin seat and the hall of the tower. She knew that the only way to save the world was to break the tower's rigid hierarchy, and she used her reputation as the ultimate Aes Sedai to do it. She spoke to the Sisters of the White Tower, directly bypassing the Amelin seat and the hall, and she told them that their duty was to the light, not to the tower's political games. She inspired younger sisters to stand up for what was right, to reject the pointless bickering, and to focus on fighting the Shadow. She made the sitters and the high-ranking sisters look foolish with their constant debates and their lack of action, and she proved that the traditional authority of the Amelin seat was nothing more than a title if the woman who held it did not have the courage to act. Cadsuane's myth as the living legend was not just a reputation, it was a weapon that she wielded with precision and skill to tear down the White Tower's hierarchy from the inside out. It allowed her to do what no other Aes Sedai could do, to challenge the established order and to force the White Tower to confront its own failures. And as the Dragon Reborn's crisis deepened, and as the Shadow drew closer, Cadsuane's legend only grew stronger. The people of the world looked to her for hope. The Sisters of the White Tower looked to her for leadership, and the Amerlin seat and the hall of the tower looked to her with fear and resentment. Because they knew that Cadsuane Melaidhrin, the ultimate Aes Sedai, the living legend, was not just a woman who refused to play their games. She was a woman who was going to burn their game board to the ground, and there was nothing they could do to stop her. Her myth was her shield, and it was the foundation upon which she would build a new future for the Aes Sedai. A future that was not defined by rank or protocol or political infighting, but by duty, by courage, and by a commitment to fighting the Shadow. A future that the White Tower had forgotten how to build, and a future that only a living legend could bring about. Cadsuane's defiance of the White Tower was only the beginning. Her greatest battle was not against the Aes Sedai hierarchy, but against the madness of the Dragon Reborn. For months, Rand had been slipping further and further into the grip of Luz Therin's madness, the taint on the male half of the One Power eating away at his mind and his soul. He was angry, he was paranoid, and he was convinced that everyone around him was either going to betray him or use him for their own gain. He had pushed away his friends, his allies, and the women who loved him, and he was on the verge of becoming the very thing the world feared the most, a mad Dragon Reborn. who would destroy everything in his path. The White Tower had no answer for this madness. They had only their rules, their protocol, and their desire to control him. Cadsuane had an answer. It was not a gentle one. It was not a kind one. And it was not one that anyone else would have dared to use. It was arrogance pure, an unadulterated arrogance weaponized into a form of psychological warfare that was the only thing capable of piercing the dragon's hardening madness. Cadsuane's internal defiance of the White Tower had prepared her for this moment for years. She had defied the Tower's authority, she had rejected their rules, and she had stood her ground against the most powerful Aes Sedai in the world. That same defiance, that same unshakable self-confidence, that same arrogance was now turned outward toward Rand al'Thor, and it was the perfect tool for saving him. Because Rand al'Thor was drowning in his own arrogance, his own power, and his own sense of invincibility. He was the Dragon Reborn, the most powerful channel in the world, the savior of the world, and he believed that he could handle everything on his own, that he did not need anyone's help, that he did not have to answer to anyone. That arrogance was fueling his madness. It was making him blind to his own flaws, his own fears, and his own humanity. And the only way to break through that arrogance to reach the boy beneath the dragon was to meet it with an even greater arrogance, an arrogance that Rand could not, an arrogance that forced him to face himself. Cadsuane's methodology for saving Rand was simple in its brutality. She refused to bow to him, she refused to fear him, and she refused to let him hide behind his title as the Dragon Reborn. She treated him not as a savior, not as a god, and not as a weapon, but as a boy, a flawed and broken boy who needed to be taught a lesson. She used her arrogance to challenge him at every turn, to confront him with his mistakes, and to force him to acknowledge his own humanity. She did not coddle him, she did not comfort him, and she did not tell him what he wanted to hear. She told him the truth, the hard and unvarnished truth, and she did it with a confidence and a swagger that made Rand seethe with anger. And that anger was exactly what Cadsuane wanted, because anger was better than madness. Anger was a human emotion, and it was a start. Cadsuane inflicted a series of brutal lessons on Rand, lessons that were designed to strip away his arrogance, his invincibility, and his belief that he was above everyone else. One of the first lessons came when Rand tried to order her around, when he tried to use his power as the Dragon Reborn to make her do his bidding. Cadsuane did not just refuse him, she mocked him. She told him that his title meant nothing to her, that his power was impressive, but not unbeatable, and that he was not the boss of her. He channeled the one power in a display of strength that matched his own, and she made it clear that she was not afraid of him, that she could take him in a fight, and that he would do well to treat her with respect. Rand was furious. He was used to everyone bowing to him, to everyone fearing him, to everyone doing exactly what he said. But Cadsuane did not bow, she did not fear, and she did not obey. And in that moment, Rand was forced to see her not as just another Aes Sedai, but as an equal, a force to be reckoned with. And that was the first crack in his armor of arrogance. Another lesson came when Rand made a mistake that cost innocent lives, a mistake that he tried to brush off as an unavoidable consequence of war. Cadsuane did not let him brush it off. She confronted him. She told him that his power came with a responsibility to value human life, a responsibility to think before he acted, and a responsibility to acknowledge his mistakes. She did not let him hide behind the excuse of the Dragon Reborn's curse. She did not let him blame Luz therein, or the taint or the shadow. She made him take responsibility for his actions, and that responsibility was a heavy burden, a burden that forced him to confront his own humanity. Cadsuane's lessons were not just about stripping away Rand's arrogance, they were about prioritizing his emotional stability over his political power. The White Tower and Rand's own allies were so focused on his political power, on what he could do to win the war, on how he could unite the nations of the world, that they forgot about his emotional well-being. They saw him as a weapon, a tool, a savior, but they did not see him as a boy who was struggling to hold onto his mind and his soul. Cadsuane, however, saw nothing else. She knew that without emotional stability, Rand's political power was useless, that a mad Dragon Reborn could not unite the nations, could not win the war, and could not save the world. She knew that the only way for Rand to be an effective leader was for him to first be a human being, who could feel guilt, regret, and compassion, a human being who could connect with the people he was supposed to save. So she put his emotional stability first. She put his humanity first. And she did whatever it took to make sure that he held onto that humanity, even if it meant being cruel, even if it meant being arrogant, even if it meant making him hate her. Cadsuane's specific brand of cruelty was the only tool capable of piercing the dragon's hardening madness, because it was the only tool that could reach the boy beneath the power. Every other person in Rand's life either loved him, feared him, or wanted to use him. His friends loved him, and they tried to comfort him, but they could not bring themselves to challenge him, to make him face his mistakes. His allies feared him, and they tried to obey him, but they could not stand up to him to make him see his own flaws. The Aes Sedai wanted to use him. and they tried to control him, but they could not connect with him to make him hold onto his humanity. Only Cadsuane was able to do all of these things because she did not love him, she did not fear him, and she did not want to use him. She only wanted to save him, and she was willing to be cruel to do it. Her cruelty was not born of malice, it was born of necessity. It was the cruelty of a teacher who has to discipline a student to make them better, the cruelty of a warrior who has to strike a blow to disable an enemy. The cruelty of a savior who has to do whatever it takes to save the world. She knew that Rand's madness was a wall, a thick and impenetrable wall that had been built by his arrogance, his power, and his fear. And the only way to break through that wall was with a sledgehammer of arrogance and cruelty that no one else had the courage to wield. Cadsuane's psychological warfare worked. Slowly but surely Rand's madness began to recede. His anger at Cadsuane turned into respect, his paranoia turned into trust, and his arrogance turned into humility. He began to connect with his friends and his allies again. He began to feel compassion for the people he was supposed to save, and he began to hold on to his humanity with a death grip. He still had the taint on his mind. He still heard the whispers of Luz therein, and he still had a long road ahead of him, but he was no longer slipping into madness. He was no longer the mad Dragon Reborn. He was Rand Althor, a boy, a human being, a savior who was learning to handle the weight of his fate. And it was all because Cadsuane Melaidhrin had weaponized her arrogance against him, had used her cruelty to pierce his madness, and had put his emotional stability above everything else. She had fought the greatest battle of her life, not with the one power, not with a sword, but with her words, her confidence, and her unshakable will. And she had won. She had saved the Dragon Reborn, and in doing so, she had saved the world. But the cost of that victory would be felt for years to come, and the consequences of her psychological warfare would ripple through Rand's life and through the lives of everyone around him. For now, however, Rand Althor was alive, and he was sane, and that was all that mattered. That was all that Cadsuane had ever wanted. Cadsuane did not just fight to save the Dragon Reborn, she fought to tear down the very foundation of how Aes Sedai see themselves and their place in the White Tower. For centuries, the Aes Sedai had ranked themselves by two unbreakable rules: age and strength in the One Power. The older an Aes Sedai was, the higher her rank, the stronger she was in the One Power, the more respect she was given. A sister who was 200 years old was automatically superior to a sister who was 100 years old, no matter how talented the younger sister was. A sister who could channel the One Power with great strength was automatically given more authority than a sister with lesser strength, no matter how wise or capable the weaker sister was. This hierarchy of age and strength was the bedrock of the White Tower. It was the first thing every novice and accepted was taught, and it was a system that no one dared to challenge. Until Cadsuane Melaidhrin. After saving Rand Althor from his madness, Cadsuane turned her attention back to the White Tower, and she set about shattering the hierarchy of age and strength, with the same brutality and the same unshakable will that she had used to save the Dragon Reborn. She did not just question this hierarchy, she subverted it, she mocked it, and she rendered it meaningless with every word and every action. She treated the most senior sitters and high-ranking sisters in the White Tower like unruly children. She dismissed their wisdom, their age, and their strength, and she proved that power and age are secondary to force of will. In doing so, she inflicted a wound on the White Tower's infrastructure that would never fully heal, a wound that exposed the emptiness of the Aes Sedai's ranking system, and that forced the sisters to confront a painful truth. Their age and their strength did not make them better, it just made them older and stronger. Cadsuane's subversion of the Aes Sedai's ranking system began the moment she stepped foot back into the White Tower, and it was on full display in every interaction she had with the Tower's most powerful sisters. She would walk into the hall of the Tower where the sitters, the most senior and most respected sisters in the White Tower, gathered, and she would interrupt their debates without a second thought. She would speak over sisters who were twice her age. She would contradict sisters who were stronger in the One Power than she was, and she would tell them that their opinions were worthless, their debates were pointless, and their rank meant nothing to her. She did not care that a sitter was 300 years old. She did not care that a high-ranking sister could channel the One Power with a strength that few could match. She only cared about one thing: whether they had the will and the courage to do what was necessary to fight the shadow. If they did, she would work with them. If they did not, she would dismiss them like a child who had thrown a tantrum. One of the most memorable examples of this came when Cadsuane confronted a group of sitters who had been debating for weeks about whether to send Aes Sedai to aid Rand in the war against the Shadow. The sitters had been arguing about rank, about who should lead the mission, about which sisters had the right to work with the Dragon Reborn, and they had made no progress. Cadsuane walked into the hall, stood in the center of the room, and told them that they were wasting their time, that their debates were nothing more than childish squabbling, and that they needed to stop worrying about their rank and start worrying about the world. She pointed to a young sister in the room, a sister who was only 50 years old, and who was not particularly strong in the One Power, but who had spent years fighting Trollocs on the borderlands. Cadsuane told the sitters that this young sister was more qualified to lead the mission than any of them because she had the will to fight, the courage to act, and the experience to survive. She told them that the young sister's age and strength meant nothing compared to her character and her resolve, and she ordered the sitters to give the young sister their full support. The sitters were furious, they were insulted, they were convinced that Cadsuane had crossed a line by elevating a young and weak sister above them. But they could do nothing about it. Cadsuane's will was unshakable, her power was undeniable, and her reputation as a living legend made her untouchable. The young sister was given the mission, and she led it with great success, saving hundreds of lives and aiding Rand in a crucial battle against the Shadow. It was a victory that proved Cadsuane's point, age, and strength are not the measures of a great Aes Sedai will and courage are. Cadsuane's treatment of the sitters and high-ranking sisters was not just an act of insolence, it was a deliberate attempt to render their traditional rank meaningless. She wanted the Aes Sedai to see that their ranking system was a farce, a system that rewarded age and strength over ability and character, a system that had made them complacent and weak. She wanted them to see that a sister's worth was not determined by how long she had lived, or how much power she could wield, but by what she did, by how she fought, by how she lived up to the Aes Sedai's sacred duty to protect the world. And she did this by making the traditional rank of the sitters and high-ranking sisters irrelevant. If a sitter's rank could not make Cadsuane respect her, if a high-ranking sister's strength could not make Cadsuane obey her, then what was the point of rank at all? Cadsuane's actions had a profound and long-term effect on the White Tower's infrastructure. They shattered the bedrock of the Aes Sedai's identity, and they forced the tower to confront the flaws in its ranking system. For centuries, the White Tower had been a rigid and hierarchical institution where every sister knew her place and where no one dared to step outside of it. This rigidity had given the tower a sense of order and stability, but it had also made it slow to act, complacent and unable to adapt to change. Cadsuane's shattering of the hierarchy of age and strength broke that rigidity. It shook the tower to its core, and it created a sense of chaos that many sisters found terrifying. But it also created an opportunity for the White Tower to evolve, an opportunity to create a new ranking system, a system that rewarded ability, character, and will instead of age and strength. The long-term damage to the tower's infrastructure was significant. Many of the senior sisters refused to accept the change. They clung to the old ways they plotted against Cadsuane, and they tried to rebuild the hierarchy that she had shattered. This infighting weakened the White Tower. It made it harder for the Aes Sedai to unite against the Shadow, and it created a split within the tower that would last for years. Some sisters supported Cadsuane. They believed that her changes were necessary, and that the White Tower needed to evolve to survive. Other sisters opposed her. They believed that she was a rebel who was destroying the White Tower's legacy, and that the old ways were the only ways. This split made the White Tower less effective, less united, and less able to fight the Shadow. But it was a necessary damage, a damage that came with progress. Because Cadsuane proved that the White Tower's old infrastructure was not just flawed, it was unsustainable. It was a system that had been built for a different world, a world where the Shadow was not an immediate threat, a world where the Aes Sedai could afford to bicker over rank and protocol. But the world had changed. The Shadow was at the gates, the Dragon Reborn had returned, and the White Tower could no longer afford to cling to the old ways. Cadsuane's shattering of the hierarchy of age and strength was a wake-up call that forced the White Tower to realize that it had to change or die. She proved that power and age are secondary to force of will, that a sister's worth is not determined by her rank, but by her actions, and that the White Tower's greatest strength is not its hierarchy, but its sisters, the women who wield the one power, who fight the Shadow, and who are willing to do whatever it takes to save the world. This lesson was a hard one for the Aes Sedai to learn. It was a lesson that came with pain and chaos, and in fighting, but it was a lesson that they needed to learn. And it was a lesson that only Cadsuane Melaidhrin could teach them. She tore down the old foundation of the White Tower, not to destroy it, but to rebuild it, to build a new White Tower, a tower that was stronger, more united, and more able to fight the Shadow. A tower that was true to the Aes Sedai's original purpose, a tower that was a beacon of light in a dark world. The road to rebuilding would be long and hard, and the White Tower would never be the same again. But Cadsuane had given them the first step, a step that no one else had the courage to take. She had shattered the hierarchy of age and strength, and in doing so, she had given the Aes Sedai a chance to be great again. Every victory has a price, and Cadsuane's war against tradition and madness came with a cost that would shake the White Tower and the Dragon Reborn's camp to their core. She had saved Rand al'Thor from his madness. She had shattered the White Tower's rigid hierarchy of age and strength, and she had forced the Aes Sedai to confront their own complacency and their own failure to do their duty. She had won victories that no other Aes Sedai could have won, victories that had saved the world from the shadow, but those victories did not come for free. The collateral damage of Cadsuane's progress was extensive. It included the loss of trust between Rand's camp and the White Tower, the alienation of potential allies, and a dangerous reliance on her personal authority, rather than a sustainable system of governance within the White Tower. And it raised a devastating question, a question that would haunt the Aes Sedai and the people of the world for years to come. Does the survival of the world justify the permanent destabilization of the Aes Sedai as a unified political force? The first and most damaging piece of collateral damage was the loss of trust between Rand al'Thor's camp and the White Tower. Rand's allies, his friends, his lovers, and the nations that had pledged their support to him had never fully trusted the White Tower. They had seen the Aes Sedai's political infighting, their desire to control Rand, and their history of manipulating kings and queens for their own gain. But they had been willing to work with the White Tower because they knew that the Aes Sedai's power was necessary to win the war against the Shadow. Cadsuane's methods, however, destroyed what little trust there was. Her brutal psychological warfare against Rand, her open defiance of the White Tower's authority, and her willingness to act independently of the Tower's leadership made Rand's camp see the White Tower not as an ally but as a threat. They believed that Cadsuane's actions were the White Tower's actions, that she was acting on the Tower's behalf, and that the Aes Sedai still wanted to control Rand and use him for their own gain. They did not see that Cadsuane was acting against the White Tower's wishes, that she was a rebel within the institution, and that she was fighting to save Rand, not to control him. All they saw was an Aes Sedai who had treated the Dragon Reborn with cruelty, an Aes Sedai who had broken the Tower's rules, and an Aes Sedai who seemed to have unlimited power within the White Tower. This loss of trust created a rift between Rand's camp and the White Tower, a rift that made it harder for them to work together, a rift that led to misunderstandings and arguments, and a rift that almost cost them the war. Rand's friends like Perrin Ibarra and Mac Hawthorne refused to work with any Aes Sedai. They believed that all Aes Sedai were like Cadsuane, cruel and manipulative, and they did not want them anywhere near Rand. The Aiel clans, who had sworn to protect the Dragon Reborn, were suspicious of the White Tower. They had a long history of conflict with the Aes Sedai, and Cadsuane's actions only reinforced their distrust. The kings and queens of the world who had pledged their support to Rand began to question their alliance with the White Tower. They feared that the Aes Sedai would turn on them once the war was over, and that they would be nothing more than puppets for the Tower's gain. This loss of trust was not just a political problem, it was a military one. The war against the Shadow required unity. It required the Dragon Reborn's camp and the White Tower to work together, to combine their power, their resources, and their armies. But the rift created by Cadsuane's methods made that unity impossible. The Aes Sedai were left to fight their own battles. Rand's camp was left to fight theirs, and the Shadow was able to exploit this division to gain ground and to push closer to victory. Cadsuane's methods also alienated potential allies for the White Tower and for Rand. There were many nations, many groups, and many individuals who were on the fence about joining the fight against the Shadow, who were unsure if they wanted to align themselves with the Dragon Reborn or the White Tower. Cadsuane's actions made their decision easy. They chose to stay neutral. They chose to not get involved because they did not want to be associated with a cruel and manipulative Aes Sedai, or a White Tower that seemed to be falling apart. The Shonchan, for example, a powerful nation with a vast army and a hatred of the Aes Sedai, might have been willing to negotiate an alliance with Rand and the White Tower if it meant defeating the Shadow. But Cadsuane's brutal treatment of Rand and her open defiance of the White Tower's rules made the Shonchan see the Aes Sedai as even more dangerous than they already did, and they refused to work with them. The Warders, the elite warriors who swore their lives to the Aes Sedai, also became alienated. Many Warders saw Cadsuane's actions as a betrayal of the Aes Sedai's values. They believed that she was putting her own agenda above the safety of the Tower and the Warders who served it. Some Warders even left the White Tower. They refused to serve an institution that allowed a woman like Cadsuane to act with such impunity, and this loss of Warders weakened the Aes Sedai's military strength significantly. The alienation of these potential allies was a huge blow to the war effort. It meant that Rand and the White Tower had fewer soldiers, fewer resources, and fewer allies to fight the Shadow, and it made the war much harder than it ever needed to be. Another devastating piece of collateral damage was the White Tower's dangerous reliance on Cadsuane's personal authority, rather than a sustainable system of governance. Cadsuane's shattering of the hierarchy of age and strength had left the White Tower in a state of chaos. The Amelin seat and the Hall of the Tower had lost much of their authority, and the Sisters of the Tower were divided between those who supported Cadsuane and those who opposed her. In this chaos, Cadsuane's personal authority became the only thing holding the White Tower together. She was the only one who could make decisions, the only one who could unite the warring factions, and the only one who could force the Aes Sedai to act. The Sisters of the White Tower began to rely on her for everything, for leadership, for direction, for decisions, and they forgot how to govern themselves. They forgot how to debate, how to compromise, how to make decisions as a group, and they became dependent on Cadsuane's unshakable will and her iron fist. This reliance on personal authority was unsustainable because Cadsuane was only one person. She could not be everywhere, she could not make every decision, and she could not lead the White Tower forever. If something were to happen to her, if she were to die in battle, or if she were to step down, the White Tower would be left without a leader, without direction, and without a way to govern itself. It would fall back into chaos, into infighting, into the same political games that had plagued it for centuries, and it would be unable to fight the Shadow. This reliance on personal authority also meant that the White Tower was not able to build a sustainable system of governance, a system that would allow it to function without a single strong leader. Cadsuane had torn down the old hierarchy, but she had not built a new one. She had destroyed the old system, but she had not replaced it with anything better. She was so focused on winning the war, on saving Rand, on fighting the Shadow, that she did not take the time to rebuild the White Tower's infrastructure, to create a new ranking system, to establish new rules and protocols that would allow the Tower to function, and this failure to build a new system meant that the White Tower's destabilization was permanent. Even after the war was over, even after the Shadow was defeated, the White Tower would remain divided. It would remain weak, and it would remain unable to function as a unified political force. This permanent destabilization of the Aes Sedai raises the most important question of all. Does the survival of the world justify it? Cadsuane's actions saved the world. She saved Rand al'Thor from his madness. She forced the Aes Sedai to act, and she helped to defeat the Shadow. Without her, the world would have fallen to the Dark One, and everything would have been lost. But the cost of that survival was the permanent destabilization of the Aes Sedai, a unified political force that had protected the world for 3,000 years. The Aes Sedai were no longer able to act as a single unit. They were no longer able to enforce peace. They were no longer able to protect the world from the Shadow in the way that they once had. And this meant that the world was more vulnerable than it had ever been, more vulnerable to new threats, more vulnerable to the Shadow's return, more vulnerable to chaos and destruction. Was that cost worth it? Was the survival of the world worth the loss of a unified White Tower, the loss of trust between allies, the alienation of potential friends, and the dangerous reliance on a single person's authority? Cadsuane would argue that it was that the survival of the world is the only thing that matters, that all other costs are secondary. And she would be right in the moment, in the heat of the war, in the face of the apocalypse. The survival of the world is the only thing that matters. But the long-term consequences of that decision are far-reaching. They are consequences that the world would have to live with for generations to come. The collateral damage of Cadsuane's progress is real, it is painful, and it is permanent. And it is a reminder that every victory comes with a price that we must be willing to pay, but a price that we must also acknowledge and understand. Cadsuane Melaidhrin saved the world, but she left it a more vulnerable place. A place where the White Tower is broken, a place where allies are divided, a place where progress has come at a terrible cost. And it is up to the people of the world, up to the Aes Sedai, and up to the next generation to repair the damage, to rebuild the White Tower, and to create a new future, a future where progress does not have to come with such a heavy price. The last battle ended the Shadow's threat to the world, but it left behind a white tower that would never be the same, a world that was forever changed, and a legacy of fractured authority that was all the work of Cadsuane. For 3,000 years, the White Tower had stood as a symbol of unity, a beacon of light, and the ultimate authority on all things related to the One Power and the Shadow. Its ancient prestige was unrivaled, its hierarchy was unshakable, and its Aes Sedai were respected and feared across the world. But the last battle changed all of that. Cadsuane's actions during the war against the Shadow tore down the White Tower's ancient hierarchy, shattered its rigid rules, and left its authority fractured beyond repair. The White Tower that emerged from the last battle was not the same institution that had existed for 3 millennia. It was a broken, a divided and a weakened tower, a tower that was struggling to find its place in a new world, a world that no longer needed the old ways, the old rules, and the old authority. And yet this broken tower, this fractured authority was exactly what the world needed, because it was the foundation of a new era. An era that could no longer hide behind the veil of ancient protocol. An era that demanded courage, action, and change. Cadsuane's legacy is the legacy of that change. A legacy of a woman who broke the world to save it, a woman who tore down an ancient institution to rebuild it, and a woman who became the ultimate irony of the White Tower. A tradition breaker sitting at the head of a broken institution as the Aes Sedai. To understand Cadsuane's legacy of fractured authority, you have to first understand the post-last battle landscape. A landscape that was defined by loss, by change, and by uncertainty. The last battle had cost the world dearly. Millions of lives had been lost, cities had been destroyed, and nations had been broken. The Dragon Reborn Randalthor had defeated the Dark One and saved the world, but he had vanished shortly after the battle, leaving the world without its savior and without a clear direction. The nations of the world were struggling to rebuild. They were fighting over resources, over land, and over power. And they were looking for leadership, for stability, for a force that could unite them and guide them into the future. For 3,000 years, that force had been the White Tower, but the White Tower was no longer able to fill that role. Its authority was fractured, its ranks were divided, and its ability to act as a unified political force was all but gone. The old hierarchy of age and strength was gone, replaced by chaos and infighting. The Amelin seat and the Hall of the Tower had lost much of their power, and the Sisters of the Tower were split between those who wanted to return to the old ways and those who wanted to embrace the new change that Cadsuane had brought. This fractured authority was not an accident. It was the direct result of Cadsuane's actions during the war. She had shattered the White Tower's hierarchy, she had defied its authority, she had treated its most senior sisters like children, and she had forced the tower to confront its own failures. She had done all of this to save the world, to save Randalthor, but she had not stopped to consider the long-term consequences of her actions. She had torn down the old system, but she had not built a new one. She had destroyed the old authority, but she had not established a new one. And this left the White Tower in a state of limbo, a state of fractured authority that would define it for years to come. But this fractured authority was not just a weakness, it was a strength. Because the old White Tower, the tower of ancient protocol, rigid hierarchy, and political infighting, was not capable of leading the world into a new era. It was a tower that was stuck in the past, a tower that was unable to adapt to change, a tower that was more focused on its own internal politics than on the needs of the world. The fractured authority of the post-last battle White Tower meant that the old ways were gone, that the old rules no longer applied, and that the Aes Sedai were forced to adapt to the new world. It meant that younger sisters were able to rise to positions of power based on their ability, not their age, that weaker sisters were able to make a difference based on their character, not their strength, and that the Aes Sedai were forced to work together to rebuild their tower and to help rebuild the world. The fractured authority was a blank slate, a chance for the White Tower to reinvent itself, to create a new identity, a new system, and a new authority that was based on duty, courage, and unity rather than rank, protocol, and age. And the person who was tasked with leading this reinvention was none other than Cadsuane Melaidhrin herself, the tradition breaker, the rebel, the woman who had shattered the White Tower's authority in the first place. Cadsuane's ascension to the Amelin seat is the final and greatest irony of her legacy. She was a woman who had spent her entire life defying the White Tower's authority, who had torn down its hierarchy, who had mocked its rules, and who had been seen as a rebel by the Tower's most senior sisters. And yet, she was the one who was chosen to be the Amelin Seat, the leader of the White Tower, the ultimate authority of the institution she had spent her life fighting against. This ascension was not a surprise to those who knew her. It was a necessity. She was the only one who could bring the warring factions together, the only one who could make the sisters put aside their differences, and the only one who could lead the White Tower into the new era. The sisters of the White Tower may have hated her, they may have feared her, and they may have disagreed with her methods, but they respected her. They respected her strength, her wisdom, her courage, and her unwavering commitment to fighting the shadow. And they knew that she was the only one who could rebuild the White Tower and restore its authority. Cadsuane's time as a Merlin Seat was defined by her commitment to change, by her refusal to return to the old ways, and by her determination to build a new White Tower, a tower that was based.
Most fans of the Wheel of Time call her a bully, a relic of an arrogant age who looked at the savior of the world and saw nothing more than a disobedient child. To many readers, Cadsuane Melaidhrin is the ultimate symbol of Aes Sedai hubris. She is the woman who slapped the Dragon Reborn, the woman who treated a living god like a petulant toddler. When we first encounter her in the late books, she feels like an intruder, a grandmotherly figure with hair ornaments who thinks she can control a man who can level cities with a thought. And yet here is the uncomfortable truth that we must face today. Without Cadsuane's ruthless and calculated arrogance, Rand al'Thor would have become a monster far more dangerous than the Dark One himself. She did not come to advise the dragon. She did not come to guard him. She came to dismantle him. She weaponized social degradation, tactical humiliation, and centuries of psychological mastery to break the stone that Rand al'Thor had become. You see, by the time Cadsuane arrives, Rand is already dying, not just from the wounds in his side or the taint on Saidin, but from a spiritual necrosis. He was hardening his heart to save the world, and in doing so, he was losing the very reason the world was worth saving. Today on As You Wish, we are decoding the legendary Aes Sedai weapon who saved humanity by breaking its hero. We are going to look past the surface-level bullying and examine the cold tactical brilliance of the woman who was brave enough to be hated so that the world could live. This is the architecture of arrogance. This is the story of the woman who bullied a god. Chapter 1. The Architect of Arrogance and the Failure of the Tower. To understand why Cadsuane is necessary, we first have to understand the catastrophic state of the world she stepped into. By the middle of the series, the White Tower is no longer the stabilizing force it once was. It is a house of children playing with matches. Under Elida, the tower had become a den of paranoia and incompetence. They treated Rand like a wild animal to be caged. They sent sisters to kidnap him, to beat him in a box, and to humiliate him through physical pain. But physical pain didn't work. It only made Rand harder. It turned his heart into a fortress of ice and steel. Enter Cadsuane Melaidhrin. She is not just another Aes Sedai. She is a living legend. Even among the long-lived sisters, Cadsuane is an anomaly. She is nearly 300 years old. To put that in perspective, when the current Merlin Seat was still a novice, Cadsuane was already the most feared Green Sister in history. She had faced the Forsaken while others were still learning to channel. She had kidnapped kings and deposed queens. She had walked away from the tower because she found its politics boring and its sisters small-minded. When Cadsuane finally decides to find Rand al'Thor, she isn't doing it for the tower. She is doing it because she sees the pattern fraying. She understands a fundamental truth that the rest of the world has forgotten. The Dragon Reborn is a man, and a man who cannot feel is a man who cannot lead. Rand at this point believed that to save the world, he had to become iron. He believed that if he could just stop feeling, if he could just make himself hard enough, then the world couldn't hurt him anymore. He was cutting off his own humanity to survive the pressure of the prophecies. This is what we call the hardening. But as any blacksmith or engineer will tell you, iron is brittle. Iron does not bend under pressure. It shatters. If Rand went into the last battle as a pillar of ice, he would have cracked the moment the Dark One touched his mind. Cadsuane saw this catastrophe in the making. She knew that a dragon who cannot cry is a dragon who cannot care. And a dragon who does not care will destroy the world just to end his own suffering. Her mission was the most difficult task ever attempted in the history of the Aes Sedai. She had to teach the most powerful man in the world how to be human again. And her method? It wasn't kindness. It wasn't motherly love. It was friction. Chapter 2. The Tactical Humiliation of a Messiah. Now let's look at the mechanics of her bullying. This is where many fans get frustrated with her. Why is she so rude? Why does she refuse to use his titles? Why does she call him boy in front of kings and Isle chiefs? To answer this, we have to look at Rand's environment. Rand is surrounded by people who fall into two categories, those who worship him and those who fear him. Both of these reactions are toxic. If everyone around you treats you like a god, eventually you start to believe you are one. You lose your connection to the common man. You lose your perspective. This is what I call divine distance. Rand was floating away from reality, protected by a shell of titles and prophecies. Cadsuane destroys this shell with a psychological sledgehammer. When she first meets him, she doesn't curtsy. She doesn't call him the Lord Dragon. She treats him with the weary patience of a grandmother dealing with a toddler having a tantrum. Think about the specific genius of this. Rand expects opposition. He expects people to try to kill him or bind him. He knows how to fight enemies, but he doesn't know how to fight someone who simply refuses to be impressed by him by calling him boy and criticizing his manners in public. Cadsuane was conducting a form of social surgery. She was stripping away the divine labels to force Rand to confront the human underneath. Every time she frustrated him, every time she made him lose his temper, she was poking holes in his mask of stone. She was forcing him to react emotionally. In Cadsuane's worldview, even rage is better than emptiness. As long as Rand was angry at her, he was still feeling something. He was still connected to the world of men. She weaponized discomfort. She made his throne feel like a bed of nails because she knew that if he ever became comfortable in his absolute power, he would be lost forever. She was the only person in the world who could look into the eyes of the Dragon Reborn, eyes that had seen the face of the Dark One, and tell him he needed to wash his face and mind his tongue. That isn't just bullying. That is a high-level psychological intervention. She was the anchor that kept him from drifting into the madness of his own ego. Chapter 3. The Paralis-net and the Illusion of Safety. But Cadsuane didn't just rely on psychological warfare. She brought the ultimate physical deterrent, the Paralis-net. This is one of the most fascinating pieces of lore in the series. The Paralis-net is a collection of ancient unravel and Ter'angreal from the Age of Legends, disguised as simple hair ornaments. It is perhaps the most concentrated collection of power on a single person in the entire world. It can detect the use of the one power and even the true power. It can disrupt weaves. It can create a shield that makes the wearer nearly invulnerable to physical or magical attack. But let's look at its narrative function. Why did Robert Jordan give her this specific tool? Up until this point, Rand's raw strength in the one power was his ultimate security blanket. He knew that no matter how many Aes Sedai surrounded him, he could simply blast his way out if he had to. He was the apex predator of the one power. Cadsuane changed that. The moment she sat in a room with him, Rand's instincts and the voice of Lews Therin in his head screamed at him that this woman was dangerous. For the first time since he learned to channel, Rand felt vulnerable in the presence of an Aes Sedai. He couldn't just will her away. He couldn't just overpower her weaves. This vulnerability was a gift, even if Rand hated it. Cadsuane used the Paralis-net to create a space where Rand's power meant nothing. In that space, he had to rely on his mind and his character rather than his ability to weave fire and spirit. There is a profound philosophical shift here. Most people in the world wanted to protect the dragon so he could fight the last battle. Cadsuane wanted to break the dragon so he could survive the last battle. She knew that the Dark One doesn't win by killing the dragon. The Dark One wins by turning the dragon, or by watching the dragon destroy the world in his own madness. By using the Paralis-net to neutralize Rand's physical advantage, she forced him into a mental chess match. She was conducting spiritual surgery. It was bloody, it was painful, and it left deep scars. But it was the only way to cut out the growing cancer of his stoicism. She was teaching him that power is not a shield against your own humanity. Chapter 4. the Formatting Gambit, and the Cage of No Power. To see Cadsuane's strategy in its purest form, we must look at the incident in Formatting. This city is a geographical anomaly, a place where an ancient Ter'angreal called the Guardian prevents anyone from channeling. For most Aes Sedai, Formatting is a place of terror. To be cut off from the source is like losing one of your five senses. But for Cadsuane, Formatting was a laboratory. It was the perfect environment to show Rand al'Thor exactly who he was, without his godhood. When Rand enters Formatting to hunt the rogue Ashamin, he is stripped of his primary weapon. He is just a man with a sword. And yet even here, he tries to maintain his mask of stone. He tries to command the world through sheer force of will. Cadsuane watches him struggle with a predator's patience. She knows that Rand is terrified of being weak. His entire identity has become synonymous with being the Dragon Reborn. But in Formatting, he is just Rand al'Thor, the Shepherd. Cadsuane uses this environment to humiliate him, not for the sake of cruelty, but to show him that his strength was actually a crutch. When Rand is eventually captured by the city's authorities and thrown into a cell, Cadsuane doesn't rush in to rescue him. She lets him sit. She lets him feel the cold iron of the bars. She lets him experience the helplessness of a common man. Why? Because she wanted him to realize that his arrogance had blinded him to the world around him. When she finally does rescue him, she does it on her terms. She forces him to accept her help as an equal, or rather as a student accepting help from a master. This was a pivotal moment in their psychological war. She proved that even in a world without the one power, she was still the one in control. She proved that her power didn't come from the source, it came from her character. She was challenging Rand to find that same internal strength. She was telling him, if you are nothing without the power, then you are nothing at all. Chapter 5, The Web of Influence and the Cadsuane Method. We also have to look at how Cadsuane managed the people around Rand. She didn't just bully the dragon, she co-opted his entire support system. Think about the way she treated Min Farshaw. Min is arguably the only person Rand truly trusts, the only person who sees the man and not the myth. Cadsuane recognized this immediately. Instead of pushing Min away, she brought her into the fold. She respected Min's visions, but she also used Min as a barometer for Rand's sanity. This is a classic Cadsuane tactic. She builds a web of influence that Rand cannot simply slash through with a sword. She did the same with the Ashaman and the other Aes Sedai. She didn't care about their ranks or their loyalties. She cared about their utility in saving Rand's soul. She created an environment where Rand felt like a child, surrounded by adults who were all in on the same secret. This is arguably where her bullying feels the most oppressive. She was suffocating his ego by surrounding him with people who were loyal to her vision of his survival rather than his vision of his own martyrdom. Many fans argue that this was her greatest mistake, that she isolated him even further by making him feel like he couldn't trust his own advisors. And they have a point. Cadsuane's arrogance was so absolute that she never considered the possibility that Rand needed a friend more than he needed a warden. She was so focused on breaking the stone that she didn't realize she was also cracking the foundation of his trust. Chapter 6, The Semirhage Incident. The plan collapses. This brings us to the turning point, the moment where Cadsuane's tactical humiliation met a force it couldn't control, the arrival of the Forsaken Semirhage. Cadsuane had spent weeks trying to provoke Rand into feeling. She had pushed him and prodded him and insulted him. She thought she had the situation under control because she had the Paralis-net and she had the experience. She thought she was playing a game of chess with a boy. She didn't realize she was playing a game of life and death with the Shadow. When Semirhage attacked, she used the Melaidhrin the Domination Band. For the first time in his life, Rand wasn't just threatened, he was enslaved. He was forced to use his own hands to attempt to kill Min, the woman he loved. This is the moment where Cadsuane's arrogance backfired spectacularly. She had stripped away Rand's defenses. She had made him vulnerable. She had forced him to feel again. And the result? Because of the Domination Band, those feelings were turned into a weapon of absolute trauma. Rand didn't break into tears. He didn't regain his humanity. Instead, he retreated into a darkness so deep, it has its own name, Darth Rand. The tragedy of this moment is that Cadsuane's failure was rooted in her own greatest strength. She believed she was the only one who knew what was best for the world. She had failed to protect the one thing she promised to guard, Rand's heart. When Rand finally broke the Adam by reaching out to the true power, he didn't just destroy the collar, he destroyed the last vestige of his connection to Cadsuane's lessons. He looked at her not with rage, but with a cold, dead indifference that was far more terrifying. He realized that for all her legends and all her hair ornaments, she had failed him when it mattered most. The birth of Darth Rand, Cadsuane Melaidhrin wanted to teach the dragon to laugh and cry. Instead, she watched as he became a ghost of shadows and cold steel. She wanted to save the man, but she ended up creating a monster. By the end of this chapter, Rand al'Thor is no longer listening to anyone. He has banished Cadsuane under the threat of death. He has embraced the true power. He is a man who has decided that if the world wants a monster to fight the Dark One, then he will give them the greatest monster the world has ever seen. Did Cadsuane push him too hard? Was her tactical humiliation the catalyst for his descent into madness? Or was this tragedy a necessary fire, a crucible that Rand had to walk through to reach the other side? The plan has failed. The legend has been humbled, and the savior of the world is now its greatest threat. But as the wheel weaves, the story is far from over. In part 2, we will explore the fallout of this failure. We will follow Rand to the top of Dragon Mount, and we will witness the ultimate redemption of Cadsuane Melaidhrin. We will answer the final question: how does a failed plan save the world? The dragon has fallen into darkness, and the woman who tried to save him is left standing in the ruins of her own arrogance. Join us for the conclusion of this epic analysis in the next episode. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because you do not want to miss the rise of the Zen Dragon. Until next time, remember, the wheel weaves as the wheel weaves, and even the most arrogant heart can be a tool of the light. In our last episode, we left Rand al'Thor at the absolute edge of the abyss. The woman who promised to teach him how to laugh and cry again, the legendary Cadsuane Melaidhrin, had watched her grand design go up in flames. The Domination Band incident was more than just a tactical failure. It was a spiritual catastrophe. When Rand reached out to the true power, the dark essence of the great Lord himself, to shatter his collar, he didn't just free his body. He cauterized his soul. He didn't become the flexible, human leader Cadsuane envisioned. He became a ghost made of shadow and cold steel. He became Darth Rand. And in his eyes, Cadsuane was no longer a mentor or even a nuisance. She was a failure, a relic of a broken tower to be banished under the threat of immediate death. For the first time in nearly 300 years, the indomitable Cadsuane Melaidhrin was helpless. Her tactical humiliation had backfired so spectacularly that it threatened to hand the world to the Dark One on a silver platter. But today, on As You Wish, we are going to argue something that feels impossible. We are going to show you how Cadsuane's greatest failure was actually the only thing that could have saved the world. We are going to deconstruct the failed plan and witness the ultimate redemption of the most divisive Aes Sedai in history. This is the story of how the dragon found his heart, and why Cadsuane Melaidhrin, despite every mistake, was right. Chapter 1. The Reign of Darth Rand and the Humbling of a Legend. After the horror of killing with his own hands while enslaved by the male Adam, Rand entered a state of being that defines the darkest chapters of the series. This is the era of Darth Rand. He no longer ran from the madness of Lews Therin. He became a singular, terrifying entity of cold logic and zero empathy. He walked through the world like a black hole, consuming light, hope, and the loyalty of those around him. He believed that to win the last battle, he had to become so hard that even the Dark One could not find a crack to exploit. And what of Cadsuane during this dark reign? This is perhaps the most human and vulnerable we ever see the Green Sister. For centuries, she had been the master of her environment. She had never known a problem she couldn't solve with a sharp word, a clever weave, or the sheer weight of her reputation. But now, she was banished. She was forced to follow Rand from the shadows, hiding in his wake like a disgraced servant. This period is a crucial psychological study. To save the world, Cadsuane had to lose her pride. She had to accept that her bully with a plan persona had reached its absolute limit. She had to watch as Rand committed atrocity after atrocity. Think of the destruction at Meriadoc, where Rand stood against an army of Shadowspawn, not as a savior, but as a harvesting machine. Think of his cold-blooded elimination of allies who dared to question his trajectory. The friction Cadsuane had created had turned into a wildfire. Rand was no longer hard like iron. He was dark like the void. He was using the true power, the very essence of the Dark One. And every time he reached for it, the stone Cadsuane tried to break only grew thicker. She realized, perhaps too late, that she couldn't humiliate a man who no longer felt shame. She couldn't teach a man who believed he was already at the end of all things. She was a legend reduced to a spectator. But it was in this state of total helplessness that her true value began to manifest. She didn't give up. She didn't flee back to the safety of the White Tower or retire to a quiet farm. She stayed in the friction. She stayed in the fire. She became the silent witness to his descent, waiting for the one moment where the stone might finally crack. Chapter 2. The Philosophy of Failure. Why the plan had to break. Now we must ask the most difficult philosophical question in the entire Wheel of Time. Did Cadsuane's failure actually cause Rand's epiphany? Think about the nature of the plan. Cadsuane wanted to teach Rand to laugh and cry by exerting control. She wanted to be the one to guide his hand. But Rand al'Thor was a man who had been controlled by prophecy since the day he left the Two Rivers. He didn't need another master, he needed a mirror. Cadsuane acted as a harsh, unforgiving mirror. By pushing him to his absolute breaking point, she forced Rand to reach a state of total exhaustion. This is a concept we see at high-level trauma recovery. Sometimes, the ego must be utterly destroyed before the true self can emerge. If Cadsuane had been a kind mentor, if she had been like Moiraine's later iterations or like Min's gentle comfort, Rand might have felt protected, but he would never have been forced to confront the monster in the mirror. He would have stayed hard because he felt he had something to protect. Cadsuane's failure provided the necessary resistance. You cannot forge a masterpiece of a blade without both the hammer and the anvil. Cadsuane was the anvil. She didn't move. She didn't break. Even when he threatened her life, she stood her ground. She just sat there and let Rand strike her with his rage and his true power weaves, until he finally realized that he was the one breaking, not her. This is the hidden wisdom of the Aes Sedai. Sometimes, the only way to save a man is to let him fail so completely that he has no choice but to change. Cadsuane's arrogance was the only thing strong enough to survive Rand's descent. Any other woman would have been killed or would have fled in terror. But Cadsuane stayed. She was the one constant in his life that his madness couldn't erase. She provided the friction that eventually ignited the spark on Dragon Mount. Chapter 3. The Dragon Mount Epiphany and the Birth of Zen Rand. Everything led to the top of Dragon Mount. Rand stood there with the access key to the Cho'adan Kal, the most powerful weapon ever created by human hands. He was ready to end the cycle of the wheel. He was ready to destroy existence itself to stop the endless loop of suffering and reincarnation. But in that moment of ultimate darkness, at the very peak where Lews Therin had once created a mountain out of his own grief, Rand finally broke. But he didn't break into pieces. He broke into peace. He realized that the reason we live again is to love again. He realized that the stone he had become was a lie he told himself to survive. When the clouds parted and the sun finally shone on the Dragon Reborn, he came down from the mountain as Zen Rand. The transformation was absolute. But look closely at the first thing he does. Look at who he seeks out. When Zen Rand met Cadsuane again, the dynamic had shifted in a way no one expected. He didn't kill her. He didn't even mock her for her failed plan. Instead, he looked at her with eyes that had seen the beginning and the end of time and said, "You may call me Rand al'Thor." This was the ultimate victory for Cadsuane, though it looked nothing like she imagined. She hadn't won the argument through her bullying. She had won because the man she wanted to save was finally back. The stone had shattered, and the soul underneath was radiant. Rand finally understood what she had been trying to do. He understood that her bullying was a desperate, clumsy, but honest attempt to keep him tied to the world of men. He forgave her, not because her methods were perfect, but because her intent was pure. She was the only one who didn't let him become a god in peace. She was the only one who kept reminding him that he was just a shepherd from the Two Rivers who was very, very tired. She was the friction that kept his soul from sliding into the void. Chapter 4. The Last Battle and the Ultimate Sacrifice. In the final act of the story, we see a new version of Cadsuane. She is still the formidable Green Sister, still arrogant, still demanding. But she has become the backbone of the dragon's logistical and spiritual support. She becomes his advisor in the truest sense of the word, not a master, but a partner in the salvation of the world. During the last battle, Cadsuane managed the impossible. While the world was literally tearing itself apart, she coordinated the Aes Sedai, managed the chaos of the battlefield, and kept the focus on the singular goal, the boar. But her greatest contribution was during the final confrontation between Rand and the Dark One. While Rand was fighting a war of philosophy and alternate realities within the Pit of Doom, Cadsuane was fighting a war of blood and steel outside. She stood as a sentinel. She was the guardian of the hero's physical body, while his soul was battling the personification of evil. And then, the ending, the final switch. When the world thinks Rand al'Thor is dead, when the funeral pyre is lit, it is Cadsuane who sees the truth. In the very last pages of A Memory of Light, she watches a stranger walk away from the funeral, a man who can no longer channel the one power, but who can simply will his pipe to light. She sees him. She knows. And for the first time in the entire series, we see Cadsuane Melaidhrin truly satisfied. She didn't need the world to thank her. She didn't need the White Tower to crown her Amyrlin, though she eventually took the seat to save the tower one last time. She just needed to know that the boy lived. She had saved the man inside the hero, the legacy of the necessary evil. So what is the final verdict on Cadsuane Melaidhrin? Was she a bully? Yes. Was she arrogant beyond belief? Absolutely. Did her methods almost destroy the world by pushing Rand into the arms of the true power? Quite possibly. But she was also the only person with the strength of character to stand in the path of a living god and say, no. She was the only one who realized that winning the last battle meant nothing if the winner lost his humanity in the process. Cadsuane's true triumph was not the victory at Merilor. It was the fact that when Rand al'Thor walked away from that mountain, he was a man who could feel the wind on his face and the love in his heart. She had broken the dragon, but she had forged the man. In the end, Cadsuane Melaidhrin is the answer to a question we all face. How far would you go to save someone who hates you? Her answer was to go all the way to the end of the world, through the fire of banishment and the shadow of failure, just to see a shepherd smile one last time. If you followed us through this two-part journey into the heart of the Wheel of Time, thank you. Cadsuane is a character who reminds us that the truth is often uncomfortable, and the people we find most abrasive are sometimes the ones we need the most to keep us from falling. What do you think? Was Cadsuane a necessary evil, or just an arrogant relic of a bygone age? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the legends that shape our favorite worlds.